I watched Henderson's breath smoke in the moonlight as he stared past me, past the circle of our lantern, toward the corniced ridge above the glacier. The wind had fallen utterly still, yet the prayer flags on the cairns strained as if in a gale. Snow grains hissed across the ice without moving. Then we heard it again, close this time. The soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps circling us, though nothing marked the snow. Men have pressed me, over the years, to set down plainly what befell our survey party in those mountains, and I find I no longer have the strength to refuse. If you would hear more of such journeys, or have known of similar tales, lend your thoughts, your approval, and your remarks, so that this record need not stand alone. To understand what we encountered, I must return to the first days of that autumn before the snow began to speak. We set out from Darjeeling on the 3rd of September 1899, under orders from the Survey of India to refine the triangulation of the eastern Himalayan chain. I was then a junior survey officer, hale and certain of the world's orderly construction, entrusted with a theodolite, a prismatic compass, and 2 Gurkha orderlies who bore my cases as if they were no heavier than bread. Our party numbered 7 Europeans and 12 local porters, with 3 Sherpa men engaged at Gum to guide us beyond the more frequented passes. Our leader, Captain Edward Markham of the Royal Engineers, was a spare, dry man of 40 with an eye like a measuring rod. Beside him marched Henderson, a Scots geologist whose talk of strata and folding ranges had carried us through many a dreary march. There was also young Lieutenant Pierce, who had never yet seen snow fall thick upon a tent, and who affected a nonchalance that fooled no one. The remaining officers were practical men, more intent upon their chains and rods than upon the romance of peaks. We intended to push beyond the better-known approaches to Kanchenjunga, toward a spur the maps of the Great Trigonometrical Survey marked only with sketchy contours and a few conjectural heights. The monsoon had broken late. That year, we counted on a narrow window of clear weather. Our instruments were of the best pattern: Cook theodolites, steel tapes, aneroid barometers, plane tables, and a precious box of chronometers we guarded more jealously than our food. The first fortnight passed in the usual discomforts: leeches in the forests below, damp that crept into every seam, the slow transformation of green hills into grey, then into rock and ice. We climbed by stages, establishing depots of tinned meat, rice, lamp oil, and ammunition, each marked upon my field book with careful bearings. At 10,000 feet, the last true trees gave way to scrub and dwarf rhododendron. At 12,000, the world became a place of stone and low thorn, and the air thinned until Pierce's jokes shortened and Henderson's pipe went unlit. It was upon the 3rd camp above the tree line that I first noticed the marked silence. Ordinarily, even in those high places, there is some sound: the cry of a lammergeier circling, the distant crack of ice, the mutter of a stream under snow. That evening, as the sun bled out behind a serried line of peaks, I became aware that I heard only our own small noises: the clatter of pans, the murmur of the porters, the cough of one of the Sherpas. Beyond that, nothing. Even the prayer flags at a nearby Chawton hung limp. "Storm brewing," Markham said when I remarked upon it. "The air grows heavy before it breaks." I accepted that at once. I accepted many such things in those days. We moved higher, crossing a moraine where enormous boulders lay like the wreckage of some older world. Our Sherpa guide, Dorji, grew more taciturn as we approached a particular pass. He walked a little apart, his eyes always drawn to a glacier that spilled down from a hidden cirque. When I asked him, in my clumsy Hindustani, whether there was a shorter way, he shook his head. "This place," he said, groping for words, "it is not good. Old thing. Here. We go quickly." I put it down to the usual mountain superstitions, which I had been instructed in the mess at Simla to treat with tact but not to indulge. The survey moved by angles and baselines, not by ghosts. The first anomaly that touched our work came on the 18th of September. We had established a station on a rocky knoll overlooking a glacier basin at perhaps 15,000 feet. The day was clear, the wind steady from the west and the snow hard underfoot. I set up the theodolite upon its tripod, levelled the instrument, and called out bearings as Pierce noted them. Henderson ranged ahead with the plane table, marking a distant rock needle that we hoped to fix. At one point, I glanced up from the crosshairs and saw upon the opposite slope of the basin a line of tracks ascending obliquely across a field of untouched snow. They were not the neat paired impressions of an ibex, nor the splayed pads of a snow leopard. Each print was elongated, almost oval, with a suggestion of toes at the fore, and they were spaced at a distance that implied a stride nearly as long as my own. "Dorje," I called. "What animal makes that?" He came to stand beside me, squinting. His face, already weathered, seemed to tighten. "Not animal," he said at last. "We go. Too high now." Markham, when he joined us, dismissed the matter. "Some poor fool of a pilgrim," he said. "These people will walk barefoot to the very edge of perdition if they think a spirit resides there." He ordered me to record the bearing of a distant col, and the business of numbers resumed its hold. That night, however, as I lay in my tent with my journal and my lamp, I found that I could not quite recall the exact proportions of those prints. I had, by habit, measured them with my eye, but my mind slid away from the attempt to fix them. I wrote only, "Unusual tracks upon east slope, possibly human." It was a small thing then, our human moment, the one that has stayed with me as stubbornly as any horror occurred 2 days later, when we were storm-stayed upon a shelf of rock with the snow driving horizontal past the tent flaps. The instruments lay swaddled in oiled cloth. There was nothing to do but wait. Henderson and I shared a tent then. He produced, from some secret recess of his pack, a tin of tobacco and a pipe that had belonged, he said, to his father, a fisherman from Peterhead. The bowl was cracked, the stem chewed, but he handled it with a care he never afforded his hammer. "My old man," he said, tamping the tobacco, "never believed I would come to these parts. He thought the world ended at the Dogger Bank. I told him, if I could but stand upon one of these high ridges and look north, I might see his boat. You would see only more mountains," I said. Aye, he answered, drawing on the pipe until the little tent was full of its familiar reek. "But I would know he was there, beyond them. That is enough." He asked then, unexpectedly, whether I meant to marry upon my return. I confessed that there was a young lady in Calcutta who wrote to me, with whom I had no definite understanding, but whose letters had become an anchor of sorts. "Keep hold of that," he advised. "These hills take more than they give. A man needs something to go back to." We spoke of home, of the sea, of the smell of rain upon dust, until the storm's voice dulled and we slept. That conversation, so ordinary, so human, is now bound up in my mind with all that followed, and with what was taken from us. The weather cleared, as it always does, and we pressed on. The air grew thinner, each breath an effort. The porters began to mutter among themselves at night, glancing toward the glacier basin as if expecting some late arrival. Once, when I stepped out to relieve myself, I found one of them, a boy of perhaps 16, standing rigid, staring into the dark. When I spoke his name, he started violently and would not say what he had heard. On the 23rd, we established our highest camp upon a broad snow terrace beneath a ridge that rose in 3 broken steps to a corniced summit. Our aneroid gave the altitude as a little over 17,000 feet. The Sherpas were uneasy. Dorje argued quietly with Markham, insisting that we had gone far enough, that no good measurements could be taken so close to the forbidden ice. Markham, who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite on the Syachen, was in no mood to turn back with his work half finished. "We are here," he said. "We shall take our angles tomorrow and be gone the next day. You shall have your rupees, Dorje. There is no demon in the snow that I cannot put a bullet through." He patted the Lee Metford rifle that lay by his camp stool. Dorje said nothing further, but his silence was not assent. That night, the wind dropped again. The sky cleared to a hard brilliance, the stars so numerous that the darkness between them seemed only a thin veil. The cold was like a physical pressure upon the skin. Our breath smoked in the tents, and ice formed upon our blankets where it touched the canvas. It was then that the sounds began in earnest. At first, I took them for the usual complaints of a glacier: a distant crack, a muffled thud, the sigh of settling snow. But as I lay awake, my ears strained, I became aware of a pattern. There would be 3 soft crunches, as of a careful footfall upon crusted snow, then a pause, then 2 more. Always in groups, always circling, as if something moved about the perimeter of our small encampment, keeping just beyond the lantern light. I told myself it was one of the porters, perhaps, or a wandering yak. Yet no bell jingled, no lowing sounded. When I at last rose and drew aside the flap, the night met me with a silence so complete that it seemed to swallow the faint rustle of my own movement. The prayer flags at the cairn above camp, which had hung slack earlier, now strained outwards as if in a strong wind, though the air about me was still. Their tattered ends fluttered without sound. I felt then, for the first time, the curious sensation that was to return on many nights thereafter. A pressure in the ears, as if I had descended rapidly, and a pricking along the nape of my neck, as though the skin there were exposed to a draught that the rest of me did not feel. I saw nothing. I returned to my blankets, telling myself that the altitude played tricks upon my senses. The next day was given over to work. The ridge above us provided excellent stations, and the air remained miraculously clear. We climbed in relays, ferrying the instruments from ledge to ledge, driving our staffs into the snow. The sun's glare upon the slopes was blinding. By noon, my eyes ached despite the smoked glass I wore. It was during one of these ascents, when I lagged a little behind the others to adjust a strap, that the midday shock came. I was alone upon a narrow traverse, the snow dropping away steeply on my left, the rock face rising sheer on my right. The only sounds were my own laboured breathing and the creak of leather. I remember distinctly that I heard, from somewhere above and behind me, the unmistakable clatter of iron upon stone, as if someone had dropped a crampon or an ice axe. I turned at once, expecting to see Pierce or Henderson cursing his clumsiness. There was no one upon the traverse, yet halfway between me and the last bend in the path lay the fresh imprint of a boot heel, sharp in the snow where no one had walked since the wind had last scoured it. As I stared, a small fragment of ice, no larger than a coin, detached itself from the rock face at my shoulder and fell, striking the snow with a sound absurdly loud in the thin air. I looked up. For an instant, just as my gaze lifted past the lip of the ledge above, something dark withdrew from the edge. Not the smooth motion of a man stepping back, but a swift, almost liquid drawing away, like a seal slipping beneath water. I saw no form, only the absence of light where light should have been. "Who is there?" I called, my voice thin. No answer came, but from far off, across the glacier basin, there rose a sound that I had not heard before and have not heard since. It was like the call of a snowcock, but drawn out, the pitch bending in a way that no bird's throat could manage, ending not in a note, but in a breath, as if something vast had sighed. When I rejoined the others, I said nothing. What would I have said? That the mountain itself had moved? From that day, our rational explanations began to fray. The porters complained that their loads had been disturbed in the night. Straps loosened, tins moved from one pile to another. Once we found a crate of biscuits set upon a rock a good 20 yards from where we had stacked it, with no footprints leading to or from it. Markham accused the men of pilfering and flogged one of them when a tin of ghee went missing. The Sherpas, however, grew more respectful of the dark. "There is something here that does not wish you," Dorje told me quietly on the 25th, as we stood together watching the clouds build in the west. "It walks when we sleep. It watches when we move. It is old, older than the ice." "You have seen it?" I asked. He shook his head. "No man sees it and comes home, but we hear, we feel. The llamas speak of it in winter when the wind is loud. They say it is the one who goes before the storms." I smiled, because that was what I had been taught to do in the face of such tales, but the smile felt thin upon my face. That night, the sounds came closer. The crunch of snow circled the tents, stopping now and then as if to listen. At one point, I heard, or thought I heard, a faint scraping at the guy rope near my head, as if something had run a hand along it. The lanterns burned low. No one spoke. Even Pierce, who had made light of the tracks, lay rigid under his blankets, his eyes fixed upon the canvas. In the small hours, there came a new disturbance. The mules, tethered at the lower edge of camp, began to snort and stamp. One of them gave a shrill, terrified bray that cut through the thin air like a knife. Men scrambled from their tents, rifles in hand. I seized mine and followed. The animals strained at their ropes, eyes rolling white, their breath pluming. They stared, all of them in the same direction, toward the dark line of the moraine. We saw nothing. The snow there lay smooth and untouched. Yet the fear of the beasts was so intense that one of them tore free, bolted a few yards, and then went down as if its legs had been cut from under it, plunging off the lip of a drift into a hidden crevasse. We heard the dull, final sound of its body striking far below. After that, no one pretended that all was well. Markham called a council in his tent the next morning. The air inside was sour with unwashed wool and fear. He insisted that we were dealing with some large predator, perhaps a bear, though none of us had seen sign of such a creature. He ordered that watches be set in pairs with rifles loaded, and that no man leave his tent alone after dusk. "We are here to work," he said, his voice hard. "We shall not be driven off by a few noises in the night." Henderson said nothing, but when we left the tent, he caught my arm. "There is a pattern to it," he murmured. "It circles, it probes. That is not the way of a beast. That is the way of a man who knows a siege." The days that followed were a study in erosion, of confidence, of sleep, of reason. We continued our measurements, for Markham would not abandon them, but our lines grew less straight, our notes more ragged. I found, when I came to write up my field book each evening, that my hand shook slightly and that I had omitted small but essential figures. I corrected them, but the errors troubled me. The sounds at night grew bolder. Once, as Henderson and I shared a watch, we heard what seemed to be the faint crunch of steps upon the very roof of our tent, crossing from one side to the other. The canvas sagged minutely, as if under a light weight. Henderson's knuckles were white upon his rifle. If it were a man, he whispered, he would call out. He would make himself known. We said nothing more. The steps ceased. The pressure in my ears returned, stronger than before, and with it a curious smell, thin but distinct, like whetstone newly broken, with a sour undertone that made me think, incongruously, of old blood upon iron. The peak encounter came on the night of the 27th of September. The day had been peculiar from the first. The sky was cloudless, yet the light had a flat, metallic quality, as if filtered through smoke. The air was utterly still. Sound carried strangely. A word spoken at one end of camp came to the other with unnatural clarity, while the nearer clink of a spoon upon a tin seemed muffled. The Sherpas moved with the wary haste of men who expect a storm where none is yet visible. By late afternoon, a faint mist began to gather upon the glacier below, though the sun still shone upon our ledge. It did not rise like ordinary fog, but appeared in patches, as if exhaled from the ice itself, then joined tendril to tendril until the basin was a bowl of slow-moving vapor. "We shall have a whiteout," Markham said. "Double the guy ropes." We did so. As dusk fell, the mist climbed toward us, but when it reached the level of our camp, it seemed to hesitate, clinging to the edge of the terrace as water clings to a lip, never quite spilling over. Beyond it, the world vanished. Only the nearest rocks remained visible. We lit our lanterns early. The men huddled close. Even Pierce was silent. The usual sounds of a camp at night were subdued. No one sang, no one told stories. Outside, the mist shifted and breathed. I had the second watch that night with Henderson. We sat upon our camp stools just beyond the circle of light, rifles across our knees, our blankets about our shoulders. The cold was intense, but I scarcely felt it. All my attention was upon the dark. For some time there was nothing. The mist heaved and sighed at the edge of the terrace, its upper surface as level as if cut with a knife. The prayer flags above, which had so often strained in non-existent wind, now hung straight down, motionless. Then, without prelude, the silence broke. From the mist below came the crunch of a foot upon snow, slow, deliberate, weighty, then another, then another. The sound was not loud, but in the utter stillness it seemed to fill the night. Henderson's hand tightened on my arm. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, though he knew I did. We both rose, our rifles at the ready. The steps continued, drawing nearer, but nothing moved at the edge of the terrace. The mist's surface did not ripple. Yet the sound came on, until it seemed that whatever made it must be but a few yards away, just out of sight. "Show yourself," Henderson called, his voice cracking. "Who goes there?" The steps stopped. For a moment there was only the thin hiss of our own breath. Then something rose from the mist. I do not know how else to describe it. It was as if a portion of the fog itself had taken on a density, a suggestion of form. A taller darkness within the grey, not sharply outlined, but present, like a man wrapped in many layers of gauze. It stood at the very lip of the terrace, no more than 10 feet from us, yet the lantern light seemed not to touch it. Where it should have fallen, it dulled and slid away. The air around us grew suddenly colder. Not the gradual chill of night, but a swift, biting drop that made the moisture in my nostrils freeze. The pressure in my ears became a pain. The hair upon my arms and neck lifted. I could see, within that dim shape, a suggestion of height, perhaps 7 feet, and a width that was not great. There were no clear features, yet I had the unmistakable impression of attention, of being regarded with a calm, almost clinical interest. My mind, trained to measure, grasped at comparisons. It was as if a man, very tall and very lean, stood swathed in drifting veils, his outline blurred, his edges indistinct. Where his feet should have met the snow, there was only mist. Henderson raised his rifle, the barrel trembling. "Do not," I said, though later I could not have said why. The thing, the presence, whatever name one gives it, did not move as a living creature would. It seemed to thin, to elongate, as if drawn out by an invisible hand, then to fold upon itself, like smoke sucked back into a chimney. As it did so, a sound issued from it, or from the air around it. It was not a growl, nor a cry. It was a low, almost conversational murmur, in a cadence that suggested speech, but in no tongue I have ever heard. The syllables, if such they were, slid over one another like stones in a river. My teeth ached with it, my vision narrowed. For a moment I felt as if I stood upon the very edge of some great drop, with nothing but that voice between me and the fall. Then it was gone. The mist lay smooth. The terrace was empty. We stood there, rifles lowered, hearts hammering, while the lanterns flickered behind us. No one else had stirred. The camp slept on, oblivious. "Did you see?" Henderson began. "Yes," I said. "I saw." We did not speak of it again that night. We did not sleep. The immediate aftermath was curiously muted. In the morning, the mist had retreated to the basin below, and the day dawned bright with a brittle, glassy quality to the light. Markham found us haggard and tight-lipped, and made a few sharp remarks about the duties of watchmen, but he did not press us. Perhaps he saw something in our faces that gave him pause. We told him later, in halting phrases, what we had witnessed. He listened without interruption, his jaw clenched, his fingers drumming upon the camp table. "You were tired," he said at last. "The air plays tricks. The mist, the cold, these things can conjure phantoms. I have seen men on the sections swear that the very seracs moved like men. We shall not panic the men with tales of ghosts." "It was no ghost," Henderson said quietly. "It was as real as you or I." Markham's eyes flashed. "Then where are its tracks? Where is its spoor? Show me something I can put in a report, and I shall believe you." We could show him nothing. The snow at the edge of the terrace lay unmarked, save for the faint depressions of our own boots. That day he ordered the camp struck. We would, he said, descend to our lower depot and finish our work from there. There was nothing more to be gained at this height. His tone was brisk, but I saw relief in the set of his shoulders. The descent was hurried and disordered. The porters, who had sensed our unease, even without being told its cause, moved with a haste that bordered on panic. Loads were lashed carelessly. A crate of plates was left behind. One of the plane tables, a beautiful instrument of brass and seasoned wood, slipped from its bearers back on a steep pitch and shattered upon the rocks below. No one went to retrieve it. As we dropped, the air grew thicker, but the pressure in my ears did not ease. If anything, it deepened into a dull ache at the base of my skull. The sounds that had haunted our nights now followed us by day. More than once I heard, above the crunch of our own steps, a second rhythm, slightly out of time, as if something walked beside us just beyond the range of sight. The animals, what remained of them, were skittish. A mule shied at an invisible obstacle and nearly went over an edge. The Sherpas muttered prayers under their breath. Dorje's face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. We camped that night upon a lower shelf near the site of our earlier station. The familiar rocks and cairns should have been a comfort, but the place felt altered, as if some subtle alignment had shifted. The glacier below, which had seemed merely a great river of ice days before, now appeared watchful. No one suggested a watch, it was understood. We sat up in pairs, our rifles across our knees, the lanterns burning low to conserve oil. The wind had returned, but it came in odd gusts, cold one moment, almost warm the next, carrying with it faint scents that had no place there. Damp earth, as of a forest floor, the sour tang of animal sweat. Once, unmistakably, the reek of stagnant water. Sometime toward dawn, there came a final manifestation. I was alone for a moment, my watchmate having gone to rouse the next pair. The camp was a scattering of low, dark shapes against the snow. The stars had faded, but the sun had not yet risen. That grey, in-between light lay over everything. From the direction of the glacier came a sound like fabric dragged over ice. I turned. At the very edge of the snowfield, where it broke away into the blue crevasses, a tall, narrow shadow stood. Not in the mist this time, for there was none, but clear against the pale surface. It was still, yet there was a sense of potential movement in it, as if it waited only for some signal to step forward. I could not see its features, if it had any, but I felt, as strongly as I have ever felt anything, that it knew we were leaving, that it watched us go with a kind of cold curiosity, as a naturalist might watch a line of ants abandon a nest disturbed by his stick. I did not call out. I did not raise my rifle. I only stood there, my breath a white plume, until the sun's rim touched the highest peak. In that instant of first light, when the snow turned briefly to gold, the shadow thinned, faded, and was gone. The ache in my ears subsided. We left that place without ceremony. No cairn marked our highest camp. No one looked back. The journey to the lower valleys took 6 days. On the second, one of the porters slipped on a patch of black ice and broke his leg. We fashioned a litter and carried him, though it slowed us. He spoke little, but when he woke from the laudanum I had given him, he whispered that something had held his ankle as he fell, something cold and smooth, like polished bone. I told him it was the shock. At night, as we dropped into the zone of scrub and dwarf rhododendron, the ordinary sounds of the mountains returned. Wind in the branches, the bark of distant dogs in unseen villages, the occasional hoot of an owl. I had thought they would comfort me, but they only served to throw into relief the unnatural quality of the silence we had left behind. By the time we reached the first inhabited valley, with its terraced fields and prayer walls, we were a ragged, hollow-eyed band. The villagers received us with the mixture of curiosity and wary respect that such parties usually commanded. But I saw them glance at one another when they thought we did not see, and touch the amulets at their throats. We made our way back to Darjeeling, and thence, in due course, to Calcutta, where the heat closed around us like a hand. There, in a whitewashed office smelling of ink and dust, we gave our official account. The report that went to Simla and thence to the survey headquarters spoke of bad weather, of altitude sickness, of the unfortunate loss of some instruments. It contained tables of angles and heights, neat sketches of ridges and cols, and a brief note to the effect that native superstition regarding certain glaciated basins rendered further work impracticable at present. There was no mention of tracks that left no imprint upon the mind, of mists that hesitated at the edge of camp, of a tall veiled presence rising from the fog. Markham would not permit it. "We are officers of the Crown," he said, as we sat around a table littered with foolscap. "We deal in facts. If we send tales of phantoms to the Surveyor General, we shall be the laughingstock of the service. Our work will be questioned, our judgment, our fitness for command. Is that what you want?" Henderson stared at his hands. "And what of the men?" he asked quietly. "What of Dorje, of the porters? They know something walked there. They may tell their lamas whatever they please," Markham snapped. "We shall not add our authority to their legends." In the end, we agreed, or at least we acquiesced. The official account became, in time, one more file among thousands, consulted by a few earnest young officers planning their own expeditions, who perhaps wondered why our work had stopped where it did, and put it down to weather and weak nerves. Privately, the matter lay less easily. Within a year, Henderson had returned to Scotland. We corresponded for a time. His letters, at first full of talk of rocks and fieldwork in the Cairngorms, grew shorter and more subdued. He wrote once that he had taken to walking the hills at night, listening to the wind. "It is never quite the same," he said. "There is always some sound: water, sheep, the distant rumble of a train. Only on those ledges did the silence have weight." In his last letter he mentioned, almost in passing, that he had awoken one winter night to find the window of his small stone cottage rimed with frost on the inside, though the fire still burned in the grate, and that upon the sill lay a narrow drift of fine, dry snow, though the ground outside was bare. He wrote that he had stood for a long time, listening, but had heard nothing. I wrote back, urging him to come to Calcutta for a season, to shake off the damp of the north, but no reply came. Some months later, I learned, through a notice in a journal, that he had died of a chill taken on a hill walk. They found him, it was said, seated upon a rock, his expression peaceful, a light dusting of snow upon his shoulders, though no snow had fallen that day in that district. As for me, I married, as Henderson had advised, and returned in due course to more temperate work. Yet the mountains did not release me. There are nights, even now in this low, humid city, when the air grows suddenly thin in my lungs, and a faint pressure comes into my ears, as if some great weight of ice lay above. I will be at my desk drafting some harmless memorandum, when the sound of a cart in the street will, for an instant, become the crunch of a foot upon the hard snow, and the hairs upon my arms will lift. Twice I have attempted to rationalize what we saw. Once I sought out a professor of physics at the Assat Presidency College, a man much given to speculation about the ether and the nature of light. I described to him, in general terms, a phenomenon of refraction and reflection in high mist, an apparition that seemed to have form and intention. "You speak of a Brocken spectre," he said. "It is well known that a man, standing upon a ridge with the sun behind him, may see his own magnified shadow cast upon the cloud or fog, ringed with coloured halos. Superstitious peasants take such things for spirits." I nodded, though what we had seen had stood before us, not opposite the sun, and had moved of its own accord. I did not trouble him with that. Another time, some years later, I attended a lecture by a visiting alpine climber who spoke of crevasse winds and the strange acoustics of glaciers. He mentioned that certain configurations of ice and snow could carry a man's voice for miles, or distort it so that it seemed to come from nowhere. Men alone at high camps, he said, hear all manner of things. The mind, deprived of familiar sounds, invents its own. Again, I nodded. Again, I thought of that low, measured murmur in the mist that had seemed less like invention than like a language not meant for us. I have told the full story only 3 times. Once to my wife, on a night when fever had loosened my tongue. She listened gravely, smoothed my hair, and said that the mountains were far away now, and that I was safe. Once to a fellow survey officer, over whiskey in the club, he laughed. Then, when he saw that I did not laugh with him, grew embarrassed and changed the subject. And once, many years after, to Dorje, whom I encountered by chance in Darjeeling Bazaar, his hair white, his back bent. "You remember," I said. He looked at me for a long time, his dark eyes clouded but still sharp. "It remembers you," he answered. We spoke a little after that. What more was there to say? In the end, I have come to an acceptance of sorts. There are things upon this earth that move beyond the reach of our instruments, that leave no trace upon our plates and tapes, yet impress themselves upon the mind with a clarity that no brass circle or steel chain can rival. We went into those heights with our theodolites and our notebooks, confident that we might fix every ridge and hollow with a number and bring them down, tamed to the level of our maps. We came away, knowing that there are places where the world looks back. What disturbs me most is not the sight of that veiled form at the terrace edge, nor the sound of its measured tread circling our camp. It is the memory of its restraint. It could, I am convinced, have done us harm had it wished. Instead, it watched, it tested, it let us go. As a man might lift the corner of a curtain, glance into a room, and, finding nothing of interest, let the curtain fall. Sometimes, in the heat of the night, when the city's noises have dwindled and even the crows are still, I will wake with the unshakable conviction that the air around me has grown thin and cold, that the walls of my room have receded, and that I lie once more upon that high exposed ledge. In those moments I hear, very faintly, as if from a great distance, the soft, deliberate crunch of a foot upon snow, circling, always circling, just beyond the edge of the light.